You ever wonder how fast a man's life can change in front of 100 strangers? The question drifted through the noise of the bar like cigarette smoke, almost impossible to hear beneath the playoff game screaming from the mounted TVs and the sharp clatter of beer mugs hitting wood. Nobody paid attention to the old man sitting near the corner booth when he said it. Nobody except Marcus Reed. Marcus sat alone beneath a flickering neon Budweiser sign, his broad shoulders filling the small booth while rainwater still dripped slowly from the sleeves of his gray transit jacket. Outside, Chicago wind pushed hard against the windows, rattling them every few seconds like the city itself was impatient. The smell of fried onions, spilled whiskey, and wet denim hung heavy in the air. Marcus loosened his tired shoulders and looked down at the plate in front of him. Meatloaf. Mashed potatoes. Green beans cooked too long. Same thing he ordered every Thursday night after the late bus route. Cheap. Hot. Quiet. Exactly the way he liked it. At 46 years old, Marcus carried exhaustion the way some men carried expensive watches. Permanently. His heavy frame sagged slightly over the table while steam rose around his food. His knuckles looked rough and swollen from years gripping a steering wheel for 12-hour shifts across South Side streets. Most people barely noticed him when he entered places like this. Some noticed too much. Tonight, unfortunately, one of those people had already locked onto him from across the room. Officer Dylan Hayes leaned against the far end of the bar with 3 other off-duty cops, all of them halfway drunk and loud enough to dominate the entire room. Dylan was the kind of white man who smiled with only one side of his mouth. Tall. Athletic. Fresh fade haircut. Expensive watch gleaming under the hanging lights. Even without his uniform, authority followed him around like cologne. Bartenders laughed harder at his jokes. Waitresses moved faster when he waved. Nobody wanted trouble with cops who spent their free nights drinking together. Especially not in a neighborhood where everyone knew how quickly a misunderstanding could become tomorrow's. Headline. Dylan noticed Marcus the second he walked in nearly 20 minutes earlier. Maybe it was Marcus's size. Maybe his silence. Maybe just the color of his skin. Whatever the reason, Dylan kept glancing toward the corner booth with the same expression people gave gum stuck beneath a table. One of his friends muttered something. The group laughed. Marcus ignored it. He kept eating slowly while rain streaked the windows beside him in silver lines. The TV crowd exploded after a touchdown replayed overhead. Glasses slammed together. Someone shouted for another round. Then Marcus heard boots approaching. Heavy. Unsteady. Deliberate. The noise around him somehow felt farther away as Dylan stopped beside the booth holding a nearly full glass of whiskey and melting ice. Damn, Dylan said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Didn't realize this place started serving bus station leftovers. A few nervous chuckles spread across the room. Marcus kept his eyes on his plate. His jaw tightened once. That was all. Dylan looked disappointed by the lack of reaction. Men like him fed off discomfort. Silence starved them. You deaf? Dylan asked. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes. Calm. Tired. Controlled. Just trying to eat, man. Dylan smirked. That right. His friends had gone quiet now, watching carefully. So had half the bar. Phone slowly appeared in hands. Marcus could feel it happening around him, that ugly shift in the atmosphere when people sensed humiliation coming and secretly wanted front row seats. Dylan tilted the whiskey glass slightly, staring down at Marcus like he was examining something unpleasant on his shoe. You people always come in here acting comfortable, he said. Like nobody else matters. The sentence landed cold. Ugly. Familiar. Marcus felt heat rise behind his ribs, but he buried it deep. He had spent most of his life learning how to survive moments exactly like this. On buses. On sidewalks. In stores. In schools. In traffic stops. You learn quickly that one wrong reaction can cost everything. So Marcus inhaled once through his nose and reached calmly for his fork again. That should have ended it. But humiliation is addictive to certain men. Once an audience gathers. Dylan suddenly tipped the glass forward. Ice cubes struck Marcus first. Then whiskey splashed across his shaved head, his face, his jacket, soaking into his food and dripping onto the table edge before splattering onto the floor. The bar exploded with shocked laughter and gasps at the same time. Someone actually whistled. Marcus didn't move for 2 full seconds. Amber liquid slid slowly down his cheeks. A melting cube dropped into his lap. The cold smell of alcohol filled his nose. Across the room, several phones were fully raised now, recording everything. Dylan grinned wide, enjoying himself. "There," he said loudly. "Now you smell like the rest of this dump." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Not from fear. Not from weakness. From restraint. When he finally looked up, something subtle had changed in his expression. Not anger. Something sharper. Focused. He studied Dylan carefully now. Really studied him. The redness around his eyes. The uneven balance in his stance. The tiny tremor in his right hand holding the empty glass. The faint trail of blood beginning beneath one nostril. Marcus stood slowly from the booth, towering heavier than Dylan expected. The room instantly tightened with tension. Chairs creaked. Somebody whispered, "Oh hell." Dylan lifted his chin, ready for a confrontation he clearly thought he could win. But Marcus didn't raise his fists. He didn't shout. He simply looked directly into Dylan's eyes and spoke in a low voice so calm it almost sounded frightening. "You need to sit down," Marcus said. "Right now." Dylan barked out a laugh. "Or what?" Marcus stared at him another second. "Because something's wrong with you." For the first time all night, Dylan's smile flickered. For a second, nobody moved. The entire bar seemed trapped inside one long breath while rain tapped softly against the windows and the giant television above the liquor shelves kept flashing silent replays of the football game no one was watching anymore. Dylan Hayes still stood there holding the empty whiskey glass loosely in his hand, but the confidence in his face had cracked just enough for Marcus Reed to notice. Most people would not have caught it. Marcus did. Years earlier, in another country, inside tents that smelled like dust, blood, and diesel fuel, Marcus had learned how to read danger before it fully arrived. Tiny things gave people away. Eyes drifting unevenly. Fingers twitching without rhythm. Skin losing color beneath bad lighting. Back then those details meant the difference between life and death. Tonight they followed Dylan Hayes like shadows. Marcus could already see the faint shine of sweat forming around the officers' temples even though the bar was cold enough for people near the door to keep their jackets on. Dylan wiped his nose quickly with the back of his hand, irritated more than concerned. When he looked down, a thin streak of red stained his skin. One of his friends laughed nervously. "Damn, Hayes. Maybe slow down on the whiskey." Dylan forced a grin, but it came slower this time. "I am fine." His voice sounded heavier now. Thicker somehow. Marcus stepped away from the booth carefully, wet whiskey dripping from the edge of his transit jacket onto the floor tiles beneath him. The smell surrounded him completely now, sharp and bitter. He could feel dozens of eyes locked onto him waiting for the explosion they expected. Waiting for the big black man to finally lose control. Instead Marcus reached for a napkin from the table and calmly wiped liquid from his face. His hand stayed steady. That surprised people more than anger would have. Across the room, someone lowered their phone slightly. The entertainment value was fading now that Marcus refused to become the stereotype they wanted. "You should sit down," Marcus repeated quietly. Dylan scoffed, but his balance shifted strangely as he took another step backward toward the bar counter. "You threatening me?" Marcus looked directly at him. No, his voice remained low and level. "I think you are in trouble." The bartender, a grey-haired woman named Sandra who had worked there nearly 20 years, finally spoke up from behind the counter. "Dylan, you do not look too good." Dylan rolled his eyes hard, but halfway through the movement he blinked twice like the room had tilted unexpectedly. One of the hanging lights reflected strangely across his pupils. Uneven. Marcus noticed immediately. Around them, the bar noise slowly returned in uncertain fragments. A few people laughed awkwardly. Someone whispered that Marcus was trying to scare him. Somebody else muttered that Dylan probably just drank too much. But Marcus knew drunk. This was not drunk. Dylan rested one hand on the counter now, fingers tightening against the wood. The ice machine hummed nearby while neon beer signs painted soft red and blue colors across his pale face. Marcus could hear Dylan breathing harder from nearly 8 feet away. Quick shallow breaths. Wrong breaths. The same kind Marcus heard years ago from wounded soldiers trying to stay conscious. Marcus hated that his mind still remembered those sounds so clearly. He had spent almost 15 years trying to forget Iraq. 15 years driving buses through Chicago nights because quiet work helped keep old memories buried. He never talked about the military anymore. Never talked about Fallujah. Never talked about the bodies he could not save. Most people who stepped onto his bus only saw an overweight middle-aged black man wearing a transit badge and orthopedic shoes. Marcus preferred it that way. Invisible felt safer. Invisible meant fewer questions. But tonight invisibility had failed him the second Dylan Hayes noticed him sitting alone. "Marcus!" Sandra's voice broke his thoughts softly. "What is wrong with him?" Marcus kept watching Dylan carefully. "I do not know yet." That was true. But he knew enough. Dylan suddenly blinked hard again and grabbed the side of his head with one hand. His friend stopped smiling. "You okay, man?" one asked. Dylan opened his mouth to answer, but the words tangled strangely together. Just for a second. Marcus felt cold certainty settle deep into his stomach. He had heard slurred speech before from heat stroke victims and head trauma patients. He glanced toward the blood on Dylan's hand again. Nosebleed. Disorientation. Uneven pupils. Sudden pressure behind the eyes. Something serious was happening inside that man's skull. The worst part was Dylan himself still did not understand it. People rarely do in moments like that. Human beings spend most of their lives believing tomorrow is guaranteed. Marcus slowly stepped closer. Nearby tables shifted back instinctively, giving them space. Chairs scraped across the floor. The football announcers shouted from the televisions overhead while outside the rain intensified, streaking the windows in silver rivers beneath the streetlights. Dylan stared at Marcus with visible irritation now, embarrassed that attention had shifted away from his performance. "Back up," he muttered. Marcus ignored the hostility completely. "How long have you had headaches?" Dylan frowned. "What?" "Headaches," Marcus repeated. "Dizziness. Pressure behind your eyes. Maybe this week." One of Dylan's friends looked confused. How the hell would he know that? Dylan tried straightening himself again, but his hand slipped slightly against the counter edge. The room around him clearly was no longer behaving normally. Marcus could see panic beginning underneath the arrogance now. Tiny. Barely visible. But real. And suddenly Marcus understood something that made his chest feel strangely heavy. 10 seconds earlier this man had humiliated him in front of an entire room because he believed Marcus was beneath him. Less intelligent. Less human. Less worthy of respect. Yet now, in the exact moment Dylan's body started betraying him, the person who understood what was happening first was the same man he had tried to degrade for entertainment. Life moved fast like that sometimes. Faster than pride. Faster than hatred. Faster than people were ready for. The tension inside the bar thickened until even the people pretending to watch the game could not ignore it anymore. Marcus Reed stood motionless near the booth while whiskey water dripped steadily from the edge of his jacket cuffs onto the black floor tiles below. Every few seconds another drop hit the ground with a soft tapping sound that somehow felt louder than the televisions overhead. Dylan Hayes tried straightening his posture again, forcing his shoulders back the way men do when they refuse to look weak in front of a crowd. But the movement did not come naturally now. It looked delayed. Unsteady. Like his body was answering commands half a second too late. Sandra stepped out from behind the bar slowly, wiping nervous hands against a towel. "Dylan," she said carefully, "maybe you should sit for a minute." Dylan turned toward her too quickly and winced slightly. The overhead lights reflected sharply across his face, revealing how pale he had suddenly become beneath the flush of alcohol. "Everybody relax," he muttered. "I am not dying." The joke landed flat. Nobody laughed this time. One of his friends, a heavyset former deputy named Rick, finally stepped closer. "Brother, your nose is bleeding pretty bad." Dylan wiped it again impatiently, but another thin line of red appeared almost immediately beneath his nostril. Marcus watched silently. His eyes moved over Dylan the same way a mechanic studies an engine making the wrong sound. Calm. Careful. Focused. Years ago Marcus had learned that panic spreads faster than truth inside crowded rooms. If he moved too aggressively now, Dylan's friends would react first and think later. Men like them were trained to view Marcus as the threat before anything else. A 6'3" black man standing over an off-duty white cop in a crowded bar at nearly midnight already looked dangerous to half the people here, regardless of reality. Marcus understood that better than anyone. So he kept his voice measured. "Do you have pain behind your eyes?" Dylan stared at him with visible irritation. "Why do you keep talking?" Marcus did not answer immediately. He noticed Dylan shifting more weight onto one leg now. Subtle weakness. Another bad sign. Nearby, someone quietly lowered the volume on the jukebox until only the low hum of old country music drifted through the room. Rain hammered harder outside. Water streaked down the front windows beneath glowing streetlights, making the city beyond the glass look blurred and distant. Marcus could smell ozone from the storm every time the front door opened. The cold air mixed with the heavy scent of fried food and liquor. "Because I think you need medical help," Marcus finally said. Dylan shook his head once. Wrong move. He immediately grabbed the side of the counter harder afterward, like the floor had shifted underneath him. Rick frowned now. "Hey, maybe we should call somebody." Dylan snapped back instinctively. "I said I am fine." But the authority in his voice sounded weaker now, dragged down by exhaustion and confusion. Marcus had seen that exact transition before. Strong men becoming frightened men without admitting it out loud. He remembered 20-year-old soldiers in desert uniforms insisting they could still walk while blood soaked through their sleeves. Pride always fought reality first. Reality usually won. Sandra looked at Marcus quietly. "You really think something is wrong?" Marcus nodded once. "I do." "What are you, some kind of doctor now?" another officer muttered sarcastically from the bar stools. Marcus ignored him. His attention stayed locked on Dylan, whose left eyelid had started twitching faintly beneath the fluorescent lights. Most people would miss it. Marcus did not. The old instincts inside him had fully awakened now, whether he wanted them to or not. It frustrated him sometimes how quickly those buried parts of himself returned. He had spent over a decade building a smaller life on purpose. Quiet apartment. Bus routes. Grocery store dinners. Sleep. Repeat. No emergencies. No uniforms. No trauma rooms. Just ordinary days that passed without anyone depending on him to save them. But standing inside this bar now, Marcus could feel those old memories rising like smoke through cracks in concrete. The desert heat. Helicopter blades. Rubber gloves snapping against tired wrists. The sound of men gasping for air while dust storms rolled outside canvas tents. He hated remembering any of it. Yet his body remembered automatically anyway. Dylan suddenly blinked several times and looked toward the television screens overhead as if trying to focus. "Why is it so damn bright in here?" he muttered. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Sandra. She looked frightened now. "Dylan," Marcus said firmly, "look at me." Dylan turned slowly. "What? How many fingers am I holding up?" Dylan frowned immediately. "Seriously? Just answer." Marcus raised 2 fingers chest high. For a brief second Dylan squinted at them too long before responding. 2. Marcus nodded slightly, though the hesitation bothered him. Around the room, the atmosphere had transformed completely from entertainment into uncertainty. Phones that once recorded humiliation now hovered lower as people realized this was no longer funny. The younger waitress near the kitchen entrance whispered to another employee, "Should we call 911?" Nobody answered her. Nobody wanted responsibility. Nobody wanted to overreact. But Marcus knew time mattered in situations like this. The body gives warnings before collapse. Most people ignore them because warning signs rarely look dramatic in real life. They look ordinary. A headache. A stumble. Slurred words. A little blood. Then suddenly everything changes. Dylan inhaled sharply again and rubbed his forehead harder now. "Man," he whispered under his breath, "what the hell is happening?" For the first time all night, genuine fear entered his voice. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. Marcus heard it instantly. And despite everything Dylan had done only minutes earlier, despite the whiskey soaking his clothes and the humiliation still burning quietly inside his chest, Marcus felt something stronger than resentment rise inside him. Responsibility. Because deep down Marcus Reed understood a truth most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Character is revealed clearest in moments when kindness feels least deserved. The storm outside rolled louder above Chicago, low thunder vibrating through the windows while the neon beer signs flickered against the wet glass like fading police sirens. Inside the bar, nobody seemed interested in the football game anymore. Every eye stayed fixed on Dylan Hayes. The off-duty officer still leaned against the counter, but the confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier had drained from him piece by piece. Sweat glistened along his forehead now despite the cold draft creeping beneath the front door every time someone entered. Marcus Reed stood 3 feet away, broad and steady beneath the stained transit jacket clinging damply to his shoulders. Whiskey still dripped from the edge of his sleeve onto the floor, forgotten now by everyone except Marcus himself. The cold liquid against his skin kept reminding him how quickly humiliation could turn into something else entirely. Dylan swallowed hard and pressed 2 fingers against his temple. "I just need air," he muttered. He pushed away from the bar too quickly. His right foot crossed awkwardly over the left for half a second before he caught himself against a nearby chair. Several people gasped softly. Marcus moved instinctively, one hand extending slightly forward before stopping himself. Dylan noticed the movement immediately. Pride flashed back into his eyes. "Do not touch me," he snapped. Marcus lowered his hand calmly. "Fine. But you should not be standing." Rick stepped closer now, concern finally overpowering embarrassment. "Brother, maybe sit down before you fall." Dylan shook his head again. "Wrong move." He closed his eyes immediately afterward and inhaled sharply through his nose. The room tilted for him this time. Marcus could see it happen in real time. Dylan's pupils struggled to focus on a fixed point while the muscles near his jaw tightened unevenly. Sandra quietly grabbed the cordless phone beneath the counter. "I am calling an ambulance," she whispered. One of the younger officers immediately objected. "Hold on. You do not even know what is wrong yet." Marcus turned toward him. "Exactly. That is the problem." The younger officer looked irritated by Marcus speaking with authority, but before he could answer, Dylan suddenly gripped the edge of the bar harder. His empty whiskey glass slipped from his hand and bounced once against the rubber floor mat before rolling beneath a stool. The sound seemed to echo through the room unnaturally loud. Marcus stepped closer again, this time more direct. Dylan. Look at me. Dylan lifted his eyes slowly. Fear lived there openly now. My head feels strange, he admitted quietly. Those 6 words changed the atmosphere completely. Men like Dylan rarely admitted weakness in public. Rick looked genuinely shaken hearing it. Sandra had already started dialing emergency services with trembling fingers. Marcus glanced toward the blood still visible beneath Dylan's nose and made a decision. The old part of him he had buried for years fully surfaced now, steady and controlled beneath pressure. You are going to sit down, Marcus said firmly. Now. Dylan tried responding with another sarcastic comment, but halfway through the sentence his words tangled badly together. Confusion crossed his face immediately afterward. He knew something was wrong now too. Really wrong. The room went silent again except for rain hammering against the windows and the distant hum of refrigerators behind the bar. Marcus carefully guided a chair closer with one foot. Easy, he said. Dylan stared at him for one long second, almost struggling internally with the humiliation of needing help from the same man he had mocked moments earlier. Then another wave of dizziness hit him visibly. His knees weakened just enough to erase the argument from his mind. Rick and Marcus both reached him at the same time. Together they lowered him carefully into the chair. Several people nearby finally lowered their phones completely. Recording no longer felt entertaining. It felt ugly now. Human. Dylan leaned forward breathing heavily while one hand pressed against the side of his head. Everything is spinning, he whispered. Marcus crouched slightly in front of him, voice calm and grounded. Stay with me. Do not close your eyes. Sandra looked up from the phone. Ambulance is on the way. Marcus nodded once. Good. The younger officer still looked defensive. How do you even know this is serious? Marcus turned toward him briefly. Because I have seen it before. Seen what? Marcus hesitated for half a second. The answer carried years he rarely spoke about anymore. Brain trauma. The room reacted quietly to those words. Sandra blinked at him differently now. Rick too. Suddenly Marcus was no longer just the heavy black bus driver sitting alone in the corner booth. Something about his posture had changed. The calmness. The precision. The absence of panic. People recognized competence instinctively when real pressure entered a room. Dylan slowly lifted his head toward Marcus again. His arrogance had faded almost completely now, replaced by disorientation and something closer to vulnerability. Why are you helping me? He asked weakly. Marcus looked at him silently. For a moment while thunder rolled outside above the city rooftops. He could still feel whiskey drying against his scalp. Still remember the laughter from 10 minutes earlier. The humiliation had not disappeared. It sat inside him heavy and bitter. But another memory sat there too. A younger version of himself kneeling beside wounded strangers overseas while explosions shook the ground miles away. Back then Marcus learned something that never fully left him. Pain does not care who deserves kindness. And emergencies do not pause for pride. Marcus finally answered in a low, steady voice. Because right now you need somebody to. Dylan stared at him speechless. Across the bar, nobody laughed anymore. The only sounds left were the storm outside, the faint buzz of neon lights overhead, and the slow, uneven breathing of a man beginning to realize how quickly power can disappear when the body itself stops obeying. The ambulance dispatcher's voice crackled faintly through Sandra's cordless phone while rain slammed against the windows hard enough to blur the glowing city lights outside into long streaks of yellow and red. Inside the bar, nobody seemed comfortable standing too close anymore. The energy had completely changed. 10 minutes earlier the room carried the ugly excitement of public humiliation. Now it carried fear. Real fear. Dylan Hayes sat hunched forward in the chair near the counter, elbows resting heavily against his knees while one trembling hand covered part of his face. Sweat darkened the collar of his black shirt. His breathing sounded uneven beneath the low hum of refrigerators and muted television commentators overhead. Marcus Reed stayed beside him, steady and watchful, like a lighthouse planted inside chaos. "Ambulance is 6 minutes out," Sandra announced nervously. Marcus nodded once without looking away from Dylan. "Good." Dylan lifted his head slightly. "I do not need an ambulance." His voice barely sounded like the same man from earlier. The arrogance was fading now beneath confusion and exhaustion. Marcus crouched lower to keep eye contact with him. "You do?" Dylan swallowed hard. "My hands feel numb." That sentence tightened something deep inside Marcus's chest. Symptoms were progressing faster now. Rick noticed it too. "Jesus," he muttered quietly. One of the younger officers paced near the bar stools, clearly uncomfortable with the situation spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Could this be a stroke?" he asked. Marcus answered honestly. "Maybe. Maybe bleeding. Maybe pressure building somewhere it should not." Sandra's eyes widened. "Can he die from that?" Marcus hesitated only half a second. "Yes." Silence crashed over the room after that word. Even the television suddenly felt too loud. Sandra grabbed the remote and muted every screen in the bar. Instantly the storm outside became the loudest thing in the building. Thunder rolled low above the city while rainwater tapped sharply against the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, grease crackled quietly on an unattended grill. Marcus stayed focused on Dylan's face. His left eyelid sagged slightly lower now. Another bad sign. "Dylan," Marcus said calmly, "I need you to answer me clearly. Are you on blood pressure medication?" Dylan blinked slowly. "Sometimes." "Sometimes" is not an answer. "I forget to take it." Marcus inhaled carefully through his nose. There it was. Another piece fitting into place. Dylan looked up weakly, trying to force a smile that collapsed almost immediately. "You really know what you are doing, huh?" Marcus did not answer right away. His mind was already calculating timing, symptoms, possibilities. Old instincts moving automatically beneath years of buried memory. He hated how natural it still felt. The younger officer crossed his arms defensively. "How exactly does a bus driver know all this?" Marcus finally looked at him. The room waited quietly. Rainwater rolled down the glass behind them like tears beneath neon reflections. Marcus spoke simply. "Before Chicago Transit, I was an Army combat medic." The sentence landed heavily across the room. Sandra stared at him. Rick slowly straightened. Even Dylan looked confused through the fog settling over his mind. Nobody had expected that answer. Marcus could see it in their faces. To them he had been background scenery 15 minutes earlier. Just another tired black man eating dinner alone after work. Nobody wondered what life he lived before driving buses through Chicago nights. Nobody imagined what he had seen. "You were military?" Rick asked quietly. Marcus nodded once. 15 years ago. "Where?" Marcus's eyes drifted briefly toward the rain-streaked windows. "Iraq." The younger officer lowered his gaze immediately. Something unspoken shifted inside the room after that. Respect arrived quietly sometimes. Not through speeches. Through realization. Dylan stared at Marcus with growing disbelief. "You are serious?" Marcus looked back at him steadily. "Very." Dylan's breathing hitched unevenly again. He rubbed both hands together weakly like he was trying to warm them despite sweat still shining along his forehead. "I thought," his sentence faded apart halfway through. Marcus already knew the rest. "I thought you were weak. I thought you were nobody. I thought I could humiliate you for fun." Marcus had heard those assumptions his entire life without people saying them directly. He did not need Dylan to finish. Suddenly Dylan's posture shifted dangerously sideways in the chair. Rick grabbed his shoulder quickly. "Hey! Stay with us." Marcus immediately moved closer. Dylan. Look at me. Dylan tried focusing, but his eyes drifted slightly out of sync before correcting again. Everything feels slow, he whispered. Marcus glanced toward the entrance anxiously. Still no ambulance lights through the storm outside. Time mattered now. Listen carefully, Marcus said firmly. Do not stand up. Do not close your eyes. Keep breathing steady. Dylan nodded weakly. Then another wave hit him. Marcus saw it instantly. Dylan's right hand suddenly lost grip against his knee. His body leaned awkwardly sideways before Rick caught him harder against the chair. Sandra gasped loudly behind the counter. The younger waitress covered her mouth with both hands. Panic threatened the room again. Marcus's voice cut through it immediately. Nobody panic. Calm. Direct. Controlled. The same tone he once used in crowded trauma tents overseas while helicopters thundered overhead carrying wounded soldiers into desert nights. Dylan looked frightened now in a way Marcus doubted he had ever allowed himself to appear before. Vulnerability stripped away ego fast. Am I dying? He asked softly. The question hung in the air beneath the storm outside. Marcus looked at him carefully. Whiskey still dried sticky against Marcus's skin and scalp. The smell lingered between them as a reminder of what had happened earlier. Humiliation. Mockery. Cruelty. Every reason to walk away sat right there in the room with him. But Marcus stayed. Because somewhere over the years he had learned that a person's worst moment should not become the measure of your own humanity. Marcus placed one steady hand against Dylan's shoulder and answered honestly. Not if I can help it. The storm settled into a steady rhythm outside, rain sliding endlessly down the dark windows while ambulance sirens somewhere far across the city echoed faintly through the night. Inside the bar, the air felt strangely still now, heavy with the quiet that comes after people realize something serious is unfolding in front of them. Nobody cared about the game anymore. The giant television screens hung silently above the liquor shelves, bright images flashing across faces that no longer looked entertained. Marcus Reed remained crouched beside Dylan Hayes, one hand steady against the back of the chair while the other rested near Dylan's shoulder, ready if his balance failed again. Whiskey stains had dried unevenly across Marcus's transit jacket, leaving dark marks that smelled sharp and sour beneath the warm scent of grease and old wood. Tiny drops still clung to the edge of his shaved scalp under the neon lights. Across the room, several phones remained lowered now, forgotten beside half-finished drinks. The crowd that once laughed had become something else entirely. Witnesses. Dylan sat breathing slowly through parted lips, trying hard to stay focused. His eyes drifted toward Marcus every few seconds with growing confusion, almost like he still could not fully understand why this man had not walked away. Stay with me, Marcus said quietly. You are doing fine. Dylan gave a weak nod. My chest feels tight. Marcus watched him carefully. That can happen when panic starts too. Rick leaned against the bar nearby, arms folded tightly across his chest while concern carved deep lines into his face. How long until the ambulance gets here? Sandra checked the phone screen again. They said traffic is bad because of the storm. Marcus exhaled slowly. Every minute mattered. But panic never helped patients. Calm did. He remembered teaching younger medics that years ago beneath desert floodlights while helicopters rattled the ground outside field hospitals. Control your breathing first. The patient follows your energy. Marcus had not thought about those nights in years, yet tonight the memories returned in flashes he could almost smell. Sandstorms against canvas walls. Sweat beneath rubber gloves. Metal stretchers rolling across concrete floors at 2 in the morning. Young soldiers crying quietly because they wanted their mothers. He remembered all of it more clearly than he wanted to. Dylan suddenly spoke again, voice rough and uncertain. I really poured that drink on you. The room stayed silent after the sentence. Marcus looked at him calmly. Yeah. Dylan swallowed hard. I do not even know why I did that. Marcus did not answer immediately. The truth sat there between them already. Sometimes people humiliate others because cruelty makes them feel powerful for a moment. Sometimes prejudice becomes habit so deep they stop hearing themselves anymore. Marcus had lived long enough to recognize both. But tonight was no longer about winning an argument. It was about keeping a man conscious long enough for professionals to arrive. Rainwater slid down the windows behind them in silver trails beneath the red neon signs, making the whole bar glow dim and unreal like an old photograph underwater. Sandra quietly placed a clean towel beside Marcus. "For the whiskey," she whispered awkwardly. Marcus accepted it with a small nod and wiped his forehead slowly. The towel came away smelling like alcohol and rain. Dylan watched him carefully while guilt settled heavier across his expression. "I thought you would just," he stopped himself. Marcus looked back at him steadily. "Just what?" Dylan lowered his eyes toward the floor. "Nobody important." "The honesty in." The answer hurt more than the insult itself. Because it was real. Marcus could feel several people around them shift uncomfortably hearing it spoken aloud. Nobody interrupted. Marcus folded the damp towel once between his hands. "That is the problem with judging people," he said quietly. "You never see the full story." Thunder rolled again outside, softer this time, like the storm itself was finally moving farther across the city. The neon lights reflected gently across Dylan's tired face while his breathing slowly steadied under Marcus's calm instructions. "Keep looking at me," Marcus said. "Do not drift off." Dylan nodded weakly. "How many people did you help over there?" Marcus frowned slightly. "What?" "In Iraq." Marcus stared toward the rain-streaked windows for a moment before answering. "Enough." Dylan studied him carefully now, no longer seeing a target or stereotype. Just a tired man carrying years most people never bothered asking about. "And now you drive buses." Marcus gave a faint shrug. "Bills still need paying." A quiet laugh escaped Sandra despite the tension, small and human and tired. Even Rick smiled briefly. The room softened for the first time all night. Marcus noticed it immediately. Fear had changed people. Humility too. Dylan leaned back carefully against the chair, exhaustion washing through him in visible waves. "I do not deserve this," he whispered. Marcus understood exactly what he meant. The help. The patience. The kindness after humiliation. Marcus looked down at the whiskey stains drying across his own jacket sleeves. Then back at Dylan. "Maybe not," he admitted softly. "But emergencies are not about deserving." The word settled over the room deeper than anyone expected. Nobody moved for several seconds afterward. The rain continued sliding down the windows. Ice melted slowly in forgotten glasses across silent tables. Somewhere near the kitchen, the fryer timer beeped twice before stopping again. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything inside the room felt different now. Because people had watched hatred lose its power in real time. Not through revenge. Through restraint. Through compassion. Through one exhausted black man choosing humanity while every person around him expected anger instead. Then finally, through the storm outside, red and blue lights flashed faintly across the wet windows at the front of the bar. The flashing red and blue lights outside painted the rain-covered windows in shifting colors while the sound of approaching sirens finally cut through the storm. Inside the bar, people instinctively stepped back from the entrance as two paramedics pushed through the front door carrying medical bags and a folded stretcher. Cold air rushed inside with them, carrying the smell of wet pavement and thunder. "Where is the patient?" one of them asked immediately. Marcus raised his hand slightly without standing. "Over here." The older paramedic moved fast toward Dylan Hayes while his younger partner began pulling equipment from a black case beside the counter. "What happened?" the older medic asked. Marcus answered calmly and clearly. "Male, late 30s. Sudden dizziness, headache, elevated confusion, nosebleed, imbalance, slurred speech, possible neurological event." symptoms escalating over the last 15 minutes. Both paramedics looked at Marcus instantly. The older one blinked once in surprise. You medical? Marcus hesitated briefly. Former army medic. The younger paramedic nodded immediately, like pieces had suddenly clicked together. That explains it. Dylan looked up weakly from the chair while the paramedics began checking his blood pressure and shining a small light carefully into his eyes. The older medic frowned almost immediately. Pressure is extremely high. He exchanged a quick glance with his partner. We need transport now. Rick stepped back farther, visibly shaken, hearing the seriousness in the medic's tone. Sandra quietly pressed one hand against her chest behind the counter while several customers exchanged uneasy looks. The reality of how close things may have come settled over the room all at once. Marcus slowly stood now, knees stiff from crouching so long. His damp transit jacket clung heavily to his shoulders beneath the neon lights. One paramedic glanced toward him again. You kept him conscious this whole time? Marcus nodded. Tried. 2. The medic gave him a long look filled with professional respect. Good work. Honestly, really good work. Marcus said nothing. Compliments always made him uncomfortable. Dylan stared at Marcus while the blood pressure cuff tightened around his arm again. His face looked pale beneath the flashing emergency lights bouncing through the windows. You knew before anybody else, he said quietly. Marcus shrugged slightly. I noticed signs. No, Dylan whispered weakly. You saw me. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Even the paramedics briefly looked up. Dylan swallowed slowly, shame filling his exhausted eyes now. I treated you like garbage. Marcus remained quiet. The younger paramedic adjusted equipment beside Dylan's chair while Sandra handed over a list of symptoms she had written hurriedly on a napkin. The older medic looked back toward Marcus. You said army medic. Yes. Where were you stationed? Marcus stared at the rain sliding down the front windows for a second before answering. Fallujah first. Then Mosul. The younger paramedic froze halfway through unpacking supplies. No kidding? Marcus gave a small nod. Long time ago. Rick looked stunned. You were overseas during all that? Marcus nodded again quietly. The room changed around him after those words. Not dramatically. Just enough. People straightened slightly when they looked at him now. The younger officer who questioned him earlier could barely hold eye contact anymore. Sandra's expression softened with something close to heartbreak. Because everybody suddenly understood the same thing at once. The man they ignored. The man they mocked. The man sitting alone eating meatloaf after a 12-hour bus route had once spent years saving wounded Americans in war zones thousands of miles from home. Dylan's breathing trembled slightly. And I poured whiskey on you. Marcus looked at him calmly. Yeah. Dylan closed his eyes for 1 second, ashamed. I thought you were just some guy. Marcus answered quietly. I am some guy. The simplicity of the response made Sandra look away quickly, blinking hard. One of the paramedics carefully helped Dylan stand while the younger medic prepared. The stretcher. Dylan wobbled immediately. Marcus instinctively stepped closer to steady him before stopping himself halfway. Dylan noticed anyway. No, Dylan said softly. Please. Marcus hesitated only a moment before supporting his arm carefully. The irony hung silently between them. Less than an hour earlier Dylan had wanted Marcus humiliated in front of strangers. Now he needed help just to stay upright. The older paramedic glanced at Marcus while they guided Dylan toward the stretcher. If he had waited longer, this could have gone very differently tonight. Sandra covered her mouth softly. Rick stared at the floor. Nobody spoke after that. Because everybody understood exactly what the medic meant. Dylan slowly lowered himself onto the stretcher while rain pounded outside the glass doors in silver sheets beneath the ambulance lights. His eyes never left Marcus now. Not with fear anymore. With realization. The kind that changes something permanent inside a person. "Why did you stay?" Dylan asked weakly as the paramedic secured straps across the stretcher. Marcus looked down at him quietly. The smell of whiskey still lingered faintly between them beneath the scent of rain and antiseptic. Marcus could have answered 100 different ways. Could have talked about duty, training, humanity, faith. But none of those explanations fully captured the truth. So instead he simply said, "Because somebody should." The older paramedic nodded slowly at those words like he understood more than he wanted to admit. Then the stretcher wheels rolled across the wet floor toward the entrance while the entire bar stood silent watching a tired black bus driver walk beside the same man who humiliated him earlier that night. And somewhere between the flashing lights, the storm outside, and the silence filling the room, every person there realized they had witnessed something far more powerful than revenge. By the time Marcus Reed stepped out of the hospital elevator 3 hours later, the storm had weakened into a cold, steady drizzle that painted the city streets silver beneath the parking lot lights. St. Gabriel Medical Center felt almost unnaturally quiet after the chaos of the bar. The sharp smell of disinfectant floated through the hallways while tired nurses moved softly between rooms under pale fluorescent lights. Marcus sat alone in a plastic chair near the intensive care unit waiting area, elbows resting on his knees while a paper cup of untouched coffee cooled slowly beside him. His transit jacket still carried faint whiskey stains even after he cleaned himself in the restroom downstairs. The fabric smelled like rain, old alcohol, and exhaustion. Most people would have gone home hours ago. Marcus almost had several times. But every time he stood, something inside him refused to leave completely. Maybe habit. Maybe conscience. Maybe simply the memory of too many people he could not save years earlier. A doctor wearing navy blue scrubs finally pushed through the ICU doors holding a clipboard against his chest. "Marcus Reed." Marcus immediately stood. "Yes, sir." The doctor offered a tired smile. "He is stable." Marcus released a breath he did not realize he had been holding. What happened? Severe hypertensive crisis combined with a small cerebral bleed. "We caught it early enough." The doctor glanced down briefly at the clipboard before looking back at Marcus with visible respect. "According to the paramedics, you recognized the symptoms almost immediately." Marcus shrugged faintly. "I got lucky." "No," the doctor said gently. "You paid attention." The sentence lingered quietly between them. The doctor continued. "If treatment had been delayed another hour or two, the outcome could have been much worse." Marcus nodded slowly while rain tapped softly against the hospital windows behind him. Somewhere down the hallway a machine beeped steadily inside another patient room. Ordinary hospital sounds. Familiar sounds. Sounds Marcus spent years trying to forget after the military. The doctor studied him another moment. "The nurses mentioned you were a combat medic." Marcus looked toward the floor briefly. "Long time ago." "Still," the doctor said quietly, "you probably saved his life tonight." Marcus did not know how to answer that. Saving lives always sounded cleaner when other people said it. In reality it usually felt messy and uncertain and heavy afterward. The doctor gave him a small nod before disappearing back through the ICU doors. Marcus sat down again slowly. His knees ached. His shoulders felt like concrete. He suddenly realized he had been awake nearly 20 hours straight after finishing a double bus route before everything happened at the bar. The coffee beside him had gone completely cold now. Marcus stared at it silently while memories drifted through his mind like smoke. The laughter when the whiskey hit his face. The phone's recording. Dylan's voice saying "people like you." He should have felt anger sitting there alone in the quiet hospital hallway. Maybe resentment. Instead he mostly felt tired. Deep tired. The kind that settles into a man after too many years carrying things nobody else notices. Footsteps approached slowly from the far end of the corridor. Marcus looked up. Rick stood there awkwardly holding a vending machine soda in one hand. The former deputy looked strangely uncomfortable without the loud confidence he carried inside the bar earlier that night. "Mind if I sit?" Marcus nodded once. Rick lowered himself into the chair beside him with a quiet sigh. For several seconds neither man spoke. Rainwater rolled down the dark hospital windows nearby beneath pale city lights. Finally Rick cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology too." Marcus looked over at him calmly. Rick rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. "Truth is, nobody stopped him tonight." "Not really. We all just stood there." Marcus stayed quiet. Rick stared at the floor. "And if you walked away after what he did," he shook his head slowly, "nobody would have blamed you." Marcus leaned back carefully in the plastic chair. "Maybe." Rick looked at him directly now. "So why did you stay?" Marcus thought about the question for several seconds. Then he answered honestly. "Because if pain is the only thing we give each other back, nothing ever changes." Rick lowered his eyes immediately after hearing that. The word seemed to hit him harder than shouting ever could. A nurse stepped quietly into the hallway a few minutes later. "Mr. Reed." Marcus stood again. "He is awake," she said softly. He asked. "For you." Marcus hesitated. Part of him wanted to leave the entire night behind forever. But another part understood this moment mattered too. So he followed the nurse through the ICU doors into a dim room filled with soft machine sounds and low blue monitor lights. Dylan Hayes lay propped carefully against white pillows, looking smaller somehow without the arrogance that once filled entire rooms around him. An oxygen tube rested beneath his nose while heart monitors blinked steadily beside the bed. Dylan turned his head slowly when Marcus entered. His eyes looked tired. Red around the edges. Ashamed. The nurse quietly stepped back outside, leaving them alone. For several seconds neither man spoke. Rain tapped gently against the dark hospital window behind the bed. Finally Dylan swallowed hard and looked directly at Marcus. "I almost died tonight." Marcus nodded once. "Yeah." Dylan's eyes filled slowly with emotion he clearly was not used to showing. "And the man I treated like garbage stayed beside me anyway." Marcus said nothing. Dylan stared down at his own trembling hands resting above the hospital blanket. "I spent years thinking strength meant control," he whispered. "Authority. Fear. Winning every room." He looked back up at Marcus with painful honesty. "But tonight the strongest person there was the one I tried hardest to humiliate." Marcus stood quietly beneath the soft hospital lights while the machines beside the bed continued their slow, steady rhythm. Then Dylan asked the question that had probably haunted him since the ambulance ride. "How do you forgive somebody after that?" Marcus looked at him for a long moment before answering softly. "Forgiveness is not pretending it never happened." The room stayed silent except for the rain outside. Marcus continued. "It is deciding somebody else's worst moment is not going to become your whole identity too." Dylan lowered his head and quietly began to cry. 3 weeks later, winter sunlight spilled softly across the South Side bus depot while Marcus Reed adjusted the collar of his Chicago Transit jacket and stepped onto the number 48 route before sunrise. The city looked washed clean after days of rain. Every sidewalk glowing faintly beneath the pale morning light. Steam rose from street grates. Coffee carts rattled open near train stations. Somewhere far above the skyline, the first orange streaks of dawn pushed through low gray clouds. Marcus moved slowly down the aisle of the bus, checking seats the same way he did every morning. Quiet. Routine. Ordinary. The engine vibrated gently beneath his boots while cold air drifted through the folding doors each time passengers climbed aboard. Nobody looking at him now would ever guess what happened weeks earlier inside that bar downtown. Most people never notice the hardest battles strangers survive. They only see the surface. A tired bus driver. Heavy shoulders. Gray in the beard. Worn work boots. Nothing special. Marcus preferred it that way. The internet had briefly exploded after somebody uploaded fragments of the bar incident online. Millions of views. Headlines arguing about race, policing, kindness, and pride. Comment sections filled with anger, praise, politics, and judgment from people who had never been inside that room. Marcus ignored all of it. He never watched the video himself. Fame felt strange when your only goal that night was keeping another human being alive. The city moved on quickly anyway. It always did. Marcus pulled the bus away from the curb just after 6 in the morning while soft jazz played quietly through the radio near the dashboard. Snow from the previous week still clung in dirty piles beside intersections. People climbed aboard half awake carrying lunch bags, backpacks, and paper coffee cups. Marcus greeted each one with the same calm nod he gave every passenger for years. Most barely looked up from their phones. At the third stop near West Madison, a woman in a blue winter coat stepped onto the bus holding the hand of a little boy no older than 8. The child paused halfway up the steps and stared hard at Marcus before digging into his coat pocket. "Mom," he whispered loudly enough for Marcus to hear, "that is him." The mother looked embarrassed immediately. "Ethan, do not stare." But the little boy already held out a cold can of orange soda toward Marcus with both hands. "My mom." Said heroes probably get thirsty. Marcus blinked in surprise. For a second he did not know what to say. The bus engine hummed softly around them while morning sunlight reflected off the windshield across Marcus's tired face. "You do not have to do that, buddy," he said gently. Ethan shrugged. "I wanted to." Marcus accepted the soda carefully. The aluminum felt ice-cold against his palm. "Thank you." The little boy grinned proudly before following his mother toward the middle seats. Marcus watched them sit down quietly through the rearview mirror. The mother gave him a small emotional smile before looking away toward the frosted windows. Marcus placed the soda carefully beside the steering wheel without opening it. Then he pulled the bus back into traffic beneath the growing morning light. Life continued moving forward one block at a time. Later that afternoon, during his final break before the evening route, Marcus sat alone on a bench outside the transit station drinking coffee while cold wind carried dry leaves across the pavement. His phone buzzed once inside his jacket pocket. Unknown number. Marcus almost ignored it before finally answering. "Hello?" Silence lingered briefly. Then a familiar voice spoke softly on the other end. "It is Dylan." Marcus leaned back slightly against the bench. Traffic hissed along wet streets nearby. "How are you feeling?" Dylan exhaled slowly through the phone. "Alive." Marcus smiled faintly at that. For a few seconds neither man spoke. Then Dylan continued quietly. "I went back to the bar yesterday." Marcus listened silently. "Nobody looked at me the same anymore," Dylan admitted. "Honestly, I do not blame them." Wind rustled through bare trees above the sidewalk while buses groaned in and out of the station nearby. Dylan's voice sounded different now. Slower. Less sharp around the edges. "I started therapy too," he said. "Anger management. Bias training. A lot of things I should have done years ago." Marcus stared out across the busy street while sunlight reflected softly off passing windows. "That takes courage." Dylan laughed weakly. "Funny hearing that from you." Marcus said nothing. Dylan's voice lowered again. "I spent most of my life thinking respect came from making people fear me." Another pause. "You ruined that idea in one night." Marcus looked down at the unopened soda can still sitting beside him on the bench from earlier that morning. "No," he answered quietly. "Life did." Silence settled gently between them after that. Not hostile silence. Honest silence. The kind that exists when two people finally stop pretending. Dylan cleared his throat softly. "I do not expect forgiveness overnight." Marcus nodded even though Dylan could not see it. "That is not how change works." Still, Dylan whispered, "Thank you for staying." Marcus watched a city bus turn slowly through the intersection ahead while golden evening light stretched long shadows across the pavement. People crossed streets carrying groceries, backpacks, winter coats. Ordinary lives moving in ordinary directions. Take care of your health, Marcus finally said. And take care of how you see people. Dylan breathed out slowly on the other end of the line. I will. After the call ended, Marcus sat quietly for another minute beneath the cold Chicago sky. Wind moved softly through the empty bus stop shelter beside him. Somewhere nearby a church bell rang for slow times across the neighborhood. Marcus opened the orange soda finally and took one long drink while traffic rolled endlessly through the city around him. Then he stood, pulled his transit jacket tighter against the cold, and walked back toward the waiting bus as the last light of evening settled gently across the streets.